For our second keynote of the day, I am delighted to welcome Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse to the stage along with Chris. Prior to Ripple, Brad served as the CEO of the file collaboration service Hightail. From 2009 to 2012, he was president of consumer applications at AOL and prior to that held previous executive positions at Yahoo from 2003 to 2009, including senior vice president. Early in his career, Brad helped to pioneer the voice-over IP industry as CEO of Dialpad Communications. He currently serves on the board of directors of Outmatch and has held board positions at Ancestry.com, Tonic Health, and interviewing Brad is Chris, and I will turn it over to you guys.
Okay, great. Brad, thank you so very, very much for coming by.
Glad to be here.
Out of Silicon Valley to DC's
the echo chamber of Silicon Valley.
Well, because we know nothing of that here in Washington. No, seriously, thank you. We know that you're really busy, and the fact that we have so many great participants throughout the week from industry, from our top regulators, and from really folks who are on the front lines in the crypto space, the blockchain space. It's just a delight to have you. So today's, as I had mentioned earlier with Chairman Clayton, pretty big day in Washington. We have Mark Zuckerberg, who has been testifying on the Hill, and we've been gathering sort of interesting snippets of information, and I know you've been keeping an eye also on his remarks. I just want to start off with asking you, what's your impression of the Libra project?
You mean white paper?
This is true. This is true.
Right. Just so we're clear.
That's absolutely true. The Libra white paper and sort of the buzz, good and bad, that it's sort of generated, and the attention that it's directed towards the crypto industry.
Well, so I'll start with, you just look at even this event, you look at how far this industry has come in really not that long a time, and I think it's incredibly positive for the whole industry. Chris and I spoke earlier this morning, and one of the things we kind of mutually observed is, had you predicted that the CEO and chairman of one of the most valuable companies on the planet would be testifying in front of Congress about crypto, and that the president, regardless of what you think of his tweet, was tweeting about crypto. It's just amazing to me how far the industry has come. Look, Libra specifically, the white paper, I think there's a lot of things still to be figured out. When the white paper first came out, it was very much kind of positioned more as it was going to be a new fiat currency. They backtracked on that. Today in the testimony, they talked about it being in a way to extend America's financial leadership. The last time I checked, Libra's based in Switzerland. That's a little confusing. Look, I think anytime you have a white paper, it's early, and you're figuring stuff out.
As a new global currency compared to the American.
Look, I really do, and some of you have heard me say this, but at Ripple, we think a lot about, we want the whole crypto ecosystem to thrive. I genuinely believe that I don't look out there at other projects and think, oh, that's bad for Ripple. Most of these projects, like if they're good, if they're successful, I think that's good for crypto, it's good for blockchain, it's by extension good for Ripple. Ripple is today, if not the leader in the space, one of the leaders without question, and so I think I want the whole industry to grow. I view it as analogous to when I moved to Silicon Valley in 1997, and the internet as we know it today was still a little, tiny embryo growing. And I think it's kind of analogous to where we see crypto and blockchain today.
Well, speaking then of Ripple, and I think it's really useful, we have some world famous economists and lawyers and policymakers scattered in the crowd, but there are lots of cryptocurrencies. And one of the questions that was always sort of is tagged along with the conversations on Libra is, are people able to just differentiate the different cryptocurrencies? And each one, particularly the more established cryptocurrencies, but even some of the sort of startup cryptocurrencies, have varying ecosystems with the different features to them. So maybe you can just walk our audience through what Ripple does, and to walk through what the particular cryptocurrency of XRP is designed to do.
Yep. So in its simplest form, Ripple is an enterprise software company that sells software to banks and financial institutions. We use as part of our tech stack a open source digital asset called XRP. We own a lot of XRP, and so we are certainly interested in the success of that broadly defined. But I think there's a lot of intentional misinformation and sometimes just confusion in the marketplace about what is Ripple versus what is XRP. And that has, I think, the misinformation and the FUD that gets spread, I think it's kind of bad for the whole industry and makes it harder. I mean, Chairman Clayton, who I think it's also just a huge sign of how far we've come, that the chairman of the SEC is coming here and spending time with us is, I think, a big positive deal. I gave him a huge shout out and round of applause for that. Yep. I think that the misinformation makes it harder for regulators to do their job. As Chris knows, one of the announcements that Ripple has made this week is we're opened a DC office at a time when I think a lot of companies in the space are running away from DC. We're running towards DC. We announced the creation of the office, and Michelle Bond, who's here, is going to be leading that office. And we announced that Craig Phillips, who formerly was a counselor to Secretary Mnuchin in the Treasury, joined our board of directors. And I think they're both indications that we are continuing to invest in making sure there's clarity in Washington, clarity, frankly, globally, with how digital assets, the different functions, the different forms. I think, as Chris knows, I think it's very dangerous to paint any industry with one broad brush. And I think that's certainly true in the crypto community. And when that happens, I think we're doing a disservice to those that are maybe working more constructively with industry as opposed to those who are trying to circumvent regulation and circumvent laws.
And again, sort of getting to XRP itself, cryptocurrencies, and particularly when you get into the world of regulation, it's all a question of definitions, both definitions from a regulatory standpoint, but also definitions from a market and industry standpoint. And it's fascinating because, if you were to ask your average American knows, on the one hand, they've maybe heard of Bitcoin, and because of what happens on the Hill, they know that Facebook has something. Maybe they'll know what the word Libra is, and then in between, it's anyone's guess. Much less the smaller cryptocurrencies. But with XRP, you describe its use case as not so much a cryptocurrency, but as a bridge currency. Could you just sort of walk us through what that is supposed to mean as a use case?
Yeah. Well, I'll first talk, I will get to describe what that means as a use case. I'll first describe why I don't typically refer to XRP as a cryptocurrency. And frankly, I don't refer to Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency also, because I did happen to go to Starbucks earlier today, and it's about 2 stores over, and I used a Visa card to pay for it. I could have used my Starbucks app. I could have used dollars. But the challenge sometimes in Silicon Valley, the echo chamber I was referring to earlier, is you have technologies in search of a problem versus a problem in search of a technology. And I think for tier 1 economies, let's say the G20, it's not clear to me that the currencies in those markets, the dollar works well, the yen works well, the euro works well, and I don't see these things as penetrating consumer use cases at scale anytime soon. Now, people often point out you have economies where you don't have a strong fiat currency, and I think that's a different story. The way we are using XRP is really to solve an institutional liquidity problem. So today, as many of you guys know, well, actually, many of you may not know, but the way banks manage money is they'll pre-fund. And so at the bank of Chris, you can be the Mexican peso, I'll be the US dollar. The bank of Brad would pre-fund to the bank of Chris. I'd put $20 million there, then over time that would get debited, and then I would re-up. But that means there's dormant capital sitting in almost the engine that is correspondent banking, the engine that is international payments. Any engine needs oil. The oil that exists in international payments is that pre-funding. That pre-funding represents $10 trillion of pre-funded, just kind of dormant capital sitting there to grease that engine. If what Ripple's trying to do is if we can make that 10 billion down to 9 billion down to 5, you've massively made the global economic engine more efficient. You can take that $5 trillion, going from 10 trillion to 5 trillion, and you can reinvest it in all kinds of stuff, whether it's, you could do dividends, you could do working capital, you can hire more people, you could, fill in blank. That's just good for everybody. By reducing the friction on these kinds of payments, I think you will find that segments of the population that are underbanked or unbanked we can offer products to them. When we talk about the unbanked and underbanked, people often, I think, get confused because banks, the Bank of Chris is a profit-motivated entity. You're a capitalist. If you could serve a customer
But a fine
profitably-
bank.
A fine bank, a very reputable bank.
Thank you.
Just don't do a tier 1 capital
Double,
ratio
yeah,
on him.
exactly.
But sorry, that was a little bank humor. That didn't work.
Wah.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway, the point being, I think we can make the whole industry way more efficient, and Ripple's very focused on that. We're trying to use XRP for that purpose. And I think that broad brush of crypto, sometimes people don't understand the different use cases. Look, I'll tell you one other interesting shout out. Congressman Budd today, the representative from North Carolina, asked a question of Mark Zuckerberg. And his question, the construct was roughly, look, there's digital assets like Bitcoin, Ether, and XRP, and how do you compare that? And those are digital assets.
That's right.
And I think that the regulatory clarity is helpful, and I think it's good that we need more Congressman Budds educated and educating to have people understand the different use cases and how these should be regulated.
Only because it's brought up Mark Zuckerberg, and one of the issues that's come up lately is you do have some members of the Libra Association, which was the governing body, which will be the governing body for the Libra system. So folks have opted out of that system.
I read that.
And I'm sure you probably did. You may have seen it. And when asked, and I'm paraphrasing, but when asked this morning, Mr. Zuckerberg had responded by saying, well, they noticed that getting involved is risky. If part of the job or part of your business is building a market infrastructure, and one that is working with legacy financial institutions, right? Like part of that is letting them know exactly what you do. And crypto is very new. And on the market side and on the regulatory side, there's just a ton of uncertainty. What you had at the end of our conversation with Clayton, one of your big XRP advocates had asked with a hand raised, had asked the chairman to make declaratory sort of statements about XRP and its status as a security or not. But I'm interested in how crypto companies, crypto firms, just more generally also navigate uncertainty, right? And particularly this question of regulatory uncertainty. As I had mentioned with the chairman, more than a couple of not just sort of sponsors of crypto projects, but also market infrastructure providers have either commented on or clamored for more clarity. So how exactly, from your seat as a CEO, how do you navigate and do your job, in a world of uncertainty, in terms of the regulation of one of, or at least of XRP, a product that you're dealing in or at least involved in, and also just the infrastructure providers who are looking for clarity themselves?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I'll borrow a comment that Commissioner Hester Peirce made, which I think I found to be very amusing and instructive. Her description, the SEC, as many people know, published a new updated framework to, I guess, a next generation Howey test, which had a whole bunch of information on there. And she commented that seemed about as clear as a Jackson Pollock painting. And I would generally agree with that. And to Chris, your question, I think, look, anybody in this room who's an entrepreneur, whether you're dealing with digital assets or you're dealing with, whatever it is, there's always uncertainty. You're dealing with something new. You're building something new. And I think that the plight of any entrepreneurial dream, the plight of any entrepreneur, is to look at the spectrum of uncertainties and figure out what do you know to be true, and then what do you can't know to be true, and then chart a path forward. I don't know who said it, but an entrepreneur who is quoted often in Silicon Valley is, if you're trying to predict the future, the best thing to do is to create it. I think in a world of uncertainty, the best thing to do is to charge ahead. And I certainly recognize that the SEC made a decision to declaratively say that Bitcoin's not a security, and that Ether's not a security, and they have for about 18 months stopped. So, look, I mean, should we stop? No, we got to keep going. We're building a business. We're fortunate to have more and more people participating as customers of Ripple. We have more and more companies taking advantage of the efficiency of the XRP ledger. It's far, again, I'm long Bitcoin. I am not bearish on Bitcoin, but I think Bitcoin, given its cost per transaction and its speed of transaction, which is quite slow, it's not going to solve a payments problem. Satoshi's white paper may have described it as a payments network, but look, if each transaction of the Bitcoin ledger costs about $1.80 and takes about 10 minutes, if you're going to use Bitcoin to buy your coffee, by the time you get your coffee, well, first of all, it's going to double the price of the coffee, or I don't. Actually, Starbucks is more than that, but it's still going to add to the price. And by the time you get it, it's going to be 10 minutes of cooling off, which doesn't make sense. By comparison, XRP transactions are about 1,000 times cheaper per transaction and 1,000 times faster per transaction. And I think that's why a lot of people are starting to use the XRP ledger for things that they had previously used Bitcoin for, or perhaps even Ether. You're seeing some of the scalability challenges there.
Well, we were going to have Mr. Nakamoto, but we couldn't find him.
He's here, or she is here.
Or she's here. But just as a brief aside, because you did say that you were also bullish on Bitcoin. Again, getting back to one of those sort of spectrum questions to again sort of highlight the different use case for then Bitcoin versus Ripple.
XRP.
XRP, where you have this idea of, do you want to use a bridge currency for an international transaction, but you have decided to sort of focus. XRP is interesting because as a bridge currency, it's not supposed to be used for things like buying coffee, right? Like and I guess
when you say supposed to, my attitude is like, XRP is an open source technology. Somebody in this room could or maybe is working on some incredibly cool XRP use case for consumers, and I say Godspeed. I'm saying what Ripple is doing, my viewpoint is the challenge of dislocating fiat currency in the G20. That's not what Ripple's focused on. Do I think there are entrepreneurs? I mean, BitPay, which is like kind of the leading crypto Stripe, if you will, is going to be supporting XRP, and I think that's great. I think, when I think about really getting mass scale, I don't think replacing the dollar at Starbucks down the street is going to happen anytime soon.
So how did you go to the decision for Ripple as to what its business strategy is going to be, right?
Well, that's a good question.
Because then the universe of different sort of business strategies must have been, I mean, even a couple of years ago, it was still pretty considerable.
Broad.
And so how did you then focus, on the cross-border problem?
So if I have a piece of advice for entrepreneurs building in the blockchain space, the number one piece of advice I have is to focus. I think there are so many different interesting applications for how you can apply blockchain technologies to increase efficiency of transactions. Any industry that has a middleman, you can use a blockchain to arguably eliminate that middleman and reduce friction in terms of cost, speed, what have you. So that means there's a lot of industries. And I think one of the mistakes that some in the industry have made is they go super broad and not very deep. Ripple has done the opposite. We have gone extremely deep in how we can use our technologies, how we can use the XRP open source ledger to solve a banking liquidity problem. And it's going really, really well. We've announced well over 200 customers. Some of the largest banks in the world are customers. I remember not 18 months ago, there's a New York Times reporter who said that no one's ever going to use XRP for liquidity. Guess what? That we are far from that. I got into this Twitter war with them about it, which caused the PR team got very upset with me. They're around here. Sorry.
Which it's just fascinating, right? Because folks, both on the Hill, academics, this question of the use case sort of permeates all of crypto. And it's unusual where you can sort of see live examples sort of on the ground, beyond, as you had mentioned, a sort of white paper phase. Could you take a second, and this is something slightly of an academic, because I am an academic, sort of question, when you look at the ecosystem, and also when you look at how you're trying to drive sort of Ripple as a business entity, like how do you look at organizations like Swift? Because when I look at Ripple, I can't ever really tell, on the one hand, like, oh wow, these guys are kind of going after Swift. That's pretty ambitious. But then I can also see kind of ways in which there's cooperation, and you could see some kind of potential collaborations. I mean, how is it? What do you think about Swift? What does your business model sort of look like when you think of an entity like Swift and you're really swinging for very big targets?
Look, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the plight that Swift has. This is a technology framework developed 4 or 5 decades ago that really has not evolved to keep up with technologies, internet-based technologies. And one of the challenges they have is it's not a traditionally corporate-run structure. I mean, yes, there's a CEO, but it's more of a consortium, a cooperative. And you don't have kind of shareholders in the traditional sense. And so sometimes decision-making isn't, it's driven more by, what do the existing cooperative members want to see happen. And, I have compared Swift. It's a little bit like if I decided I was going to send you a postcard. I'd write, Chris, put your address on it, stick it in a mailbox. I have no idea what happens after I stick it in the mailbox. Matter of fact, I don't even know if you got it. The only way I know you got it is because you send me a text or something, hey, it's a nice postcard, whatever. I mean, that actually is how Swift kind of works today. You send a Swift transaction, a Swift message out there. You don't know if the person, other than someone telling you they received the funds via email or phone or what have you, you don't even know if they got the money. I think that, look, we have moved into a world where we expect the ability up here on stage. I could go to DoorDash or whatever the local one is in Washington, D.C., and probably get ice cream delivered to me before the 20 minutes is up on the screen up here. Sorry, you guys can't see that. That's a crazy real-time world, yet, many people have heard me say, it's crazy to me that the fastest way to get money from Washington to London today is to drive to Dulles and fly it there. And that's just, that's very surprising in 2019 in a world where the internet, as we know it today, is very real time. And I think at its core, what Ripple is trying to do is to stitch together disparate, interoperable, non-interoperable networks for interoperability. The other one, there might be somebody here from PayPal, which I apologize in advance, but look, I'm a PayPal customer, I'm a Venmo customer. They're owned by PayPal. If I want to move funds from PayPal to Venmo, go read the FAQs, and it describes how you move PayPal money back to your bank and from bank back to Venmo. Like, if that's not the definition of non-interoperable networks by one company, but that's the state of payment networks on planet Earth today.
Well, how do you view stablecoins? I mean, because these are also other kinds of solutions that people are trying to think through. Many still, in their white paper stage. I guess it's anyone's sort of, there's debate as to whether or not Libras would have constituted a real stablecoin or not. It sounds like, from what I've heard on the Hill, they may be rethinking how they want to operationalize, their basket, and whether or not they want to have a basket of different currencies.
Well, if it's a basket, it's really an ETF, right?
And it is an ETF.
If I were Chairman Clayton and I were looking at Libra's first definition of what it was going to be, it would be regulated as an ETF.
Right.
It's a basket of currencies that you can buy through one vehicle. That's an ETF.
Well, certainly some of the terminology that was used very closely resembles the kind of terminology that you see in an ETF. How do you view stablecoins? How do you think that stablecoins will impact your business?
So the good thing is a stablecoin of the US dollar, a stablecoin of fill in blank, still needs to drive interoperability to across another network into another currency.
That's true.
And so again, I go back to we're trying to enable friction, as low friction as possible, as fast as possible, interoperability between these various networks, between these various currencies. And in that context, we think the liquidity of the XRP ledger and XRP market allows that to happen extremely efficiently. I think it's interesting to see what's happening in stablecoins. I think in some ways they've exceeded where I thought they were going to be. But to be clear, I think stablecoins are here to stay. I think there's going to be more and more of them. And I'm intrigued by those that are launching new stablecoins.
Have they performed better than you would?
Yes. Yeah. I thought originally when the first stablecoins were announced, I feel like I kind of was like, this might be just a passing fancy. And I think I was wrong about that.
Well, when you look at the valuation of cryptocurrencies, there were some people in the audience. We had like a collection and a book coming from last year's FinTech Week, where one of the chapters tried to think through the valuation of a cryptocurrency. Number one, what do you think XRP is worth? And then B, how do you, I mean, you said you hold a lot of it. So, what do you think it's actually worth? And, just in general.
Can I look at my phone? I'll tell you what it's actually worth. I think
not the market value. We're talking about the real value here. And then secondly, how easy or hard do you think it is to put a value or price on some of the more established cryptocurrencies generally?
Look, the only thing I know for sure is the total market cap of all crypto is somewhere around 250 billion. I think today Bitcoin's dominance of that is like 65%. It is, I think, kind of a fool's errand to predict where is that going to be higher or lower tomorrow. If I understood what's driving the crypto markets on a day-to-day basis, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. It's a mystery to me. There's days when Bitcoin goes up that I'm like, wow, that seems like there's very positive macro dynamics unfolding, and Bitcoin goes down. I think over the long haul, well, there's a famous Warren Buffett saying that in the short term, the markets are a voting machine, and the long term, they're a weighing machine. I don't know how long the long term is in the crypto markets. I don't spend a lot of time getting wrapped up in what's happening in the crypto markets over 3 days or 3 weeks or even 3 months.
Speculation is and continues to be a driver in lots of the cryptocurrency markets more generally. When you think about the question of creating a use case specifically for any cryptocurrency, you have to, especially when that cryptocurrency is trading on a market, it creates, I would assume, certain kinds of just practical questions when you're trying to, again, engage with some of your legacy infrastructure providers. What does the volatility, how has the volatility of XRP impacted anyone who's operating in the ecosystem and trying to do something with it?
So one of our products, as I described earlier with the MoneyGram example, the Bank of Chris going from dollars to pesos, and I was describing you use XRP as a kind of a shuttle, a bridge currency. What people often ask, like, well, wait a minute, I could never use that because the volatility of the digital asset in XRP could obviate, could mean that the transaction is not profitable if I'm selling that to an end user. And I think this is a red herring issue. This is not a real issue with XRP. It's a real issue with slow transaction time digital assets. But here, somebody in this room, I'm sure, is more of a math quant than I am, and you can correct me on the details here. But volatility measurement is both a measure of volatility and duration. And so if you take a SWIFT transaction, and a SWIFT transaction, let's say on average it's a 3-day settlement time, that's about 260,000 seconds. Bear with me on that, I did the math. So if you take a low volatile asset like a fiat currency over a long arc of time, and you compare that to a highly volatile asset like XRP, but an XRP transaction is about between 3 and 4 seconds. So you have a high volatile asset over 3 or 4 seconds, or you have a low volatile asset over 260,000 seconds. It turns out there's more volatility risk in the SWIFT fiat transaction. Yeah. That's just math. Now what happens though when you're doing a SWIFT transaction is someone is selling you to hedge that transaction. They're saying, I will settle that transaction in 3 days' time at this price, right, but I'm selling that to you. That's part of the price of the transaction. Now, you don't really need somebody to hedge the value in a 3-second transaction. Now, by the way, if you do need someone to, eventually the marketplace will create that. Somebody will enter that and they will provide that.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think an XRP, I'm not sure it's ever needed an XRP because it's so fast that like, why do you
Well,
need
that's
it?
what I was about to ask.
In Bitcoin, maybe, you know, look, if you wanted to use Bitcoin for payments and you said, well, the average transaction time is 10 minutes, and you said, look, there's been times when the price of Bitcoin's gone up 2% or down 2% in 10 minutes. By the way, I don't know if that's the case. I'd have somebody smarter than me. Then you might have some market maker saying, I'll hedge that for you.
Well, I mean, this is just. I mean, I don't want to get too far off, but this is a really interesting point. I mean, you are seeing the financialization, if one will, of certain cryptocurrencies. Futures contracts for Bitcoin. We had Heath Tarbert, the chairman of the CFTC, for FinTech Week on Monday, and he was talking about forward or futures contracts within the next 6 months for Ethereum. You know, and that is an interesting sort of just general question. If one was to create sort of this larger hedging or derivatives market for something like XRP, you know, which is weird because you have all these other actors who may not have a direct financial interest sort of or stake. You know, how does that speak to speculation and or, you know, a trade-off of just making people's lives a little bit more challenging when you're trying to navigate and build products off of a platform or using a particular digital asset. So good luck with that if that comes your way. So just a couple of questions. Since you're here in DC, you have an opportunity. Literally, we have. Someone's telling me to ask Q&A. Okay, that's fine.
We're opening it up.
We will open it up for questions.
Brad, thanks for being here with us today. This is a really easy question for you.
I love the easy questions.
You might not love this one.
Uh-oh.
But I'd pay all my XRP to have you answer it. Maybe not really. With Ripple focused on providing on-demand liquidity and the world facing what's probably the biggest liquidity crisis ever, what role do you see XRP and XRP Ledger and similar technologies playing in alleviating such a crisis?
Well, so if you think about like what causes those kinds of crises, one of the dynamics, and by the way, there's lots of inputs into a crisis like that. One of them is friction. One of them is time. If you can reduce friction as measured by time and cost, that's good. That's just a good thing to minimizing, you know, the risks of liquidity issues. You know, like I don't pretend that XRP is a panacea for all of these issues. What I do believe is if we can successfully integrate into the existing system, we're going to more rapidly bring the benefits of these technologies to a much, much, much broader audience than if we try to circumvent the system. So I've been incredibly pleased by the engagement we've had, you know, ranging from the IMF to, you know, central banks. And, you know, look, Ripple's going to continue to work with those players. That's part of why we made the announcements we made this week about expanding, or really creating our presence more concretely here in Washington, D.C. And I'm optimistic that if these technologies continue to propagate across correspondent banking, but other industries, that's going to be good for any liquidity crisis.
Linda Zhang.
Thank you.
Former Federal Reserve.
So congratulations on your 400 new customers. And I want to find out what is the current volumes of payments going through Ripple right now amongst your bank customers. And also, my background's in bank regulation, so I'm trying to understand how Ripple works with banking activities. If, depending on how the SEC comes out, whether XRP is determined to be a security, or if not, then it would have to be most likely an intangible asset. Then it would have to be deducted from the Basel capital requirements. How does this all work with your banking customers when they use your services?
I missed that very, very last part of the question. How does this all work with what?
For your banking customers when they use your services.
So like, there are a few different questions embedded in there. I'll start with, I think, the kind of the big elephant in the room, given how Chairman Clayton's question ended earlier. Look, I, Brad Garlinghouse, believe it's very clear that XRP is not a security. I think there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. One of them, quite frankly, is in the hypothetical world, Ripple could shut down. Literally, I can fly back to California, send everybody home tomorrow, and there's 140 exchanges around the world that trade XRP, and XRP is going to keep trading. Now, do I think it's great that if one major player in the XRP ecosystem isn't playing? Yeah, that's not great. However, I think, and I was actually trying to pull some data on this morning, and I didn't get this. I think Coil is doing more XRP transactions per day right now than Ripple is. And the reason is that the Coil transactions are micro transactions. They're very, 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 very small payments. And so the volume is much higher. So look, I think the SEC is trying to think through not just for XRP, but a whole bunch of different digital assets. How should we think about these things? I don't pretend it's a simple issue. I think the good news is I think that's a constructive conversation. And I'm not losing a lot of sleep that our customers aren't going to be able to continue to use XRP for liquidity based upon the SEC doing something. The other part of your question, I think, was around volume. Look, one of the things, people ask us a lot about volume, and one of the things I want this audience to understand, banks don't want me to tell you exactly what their volumes are going. Like, that's a private thing for them. We have shared an aggregate. Last year we ended up in the many tens of thousands of transactions. We're growing those transactions to the tune of 10x year over year, kind of doubling almost every quarter. So there's two dynamics that happen there, by the way. We're adding new banks, new financial institutions to the network, and that's good because that means there's more members, and they add volume. But then there's also more nodes on the network. So if you are a bank, I'm going to hypothetically describe Santander. Santander is one of our major customers. They might have gone live with 2 corridors. And then next year, next quarter, they add 2 other corridors and 2 other currency pairs. And so you have this exponential kind of growth because you're not just adding new banks and new financial institutions to the network, but they're adding more and more corridors. I mean, even MoneyGram, which has been quite public about their work with us, I got a call from the CEO. I probably shouldn't say this. I got a call from the CEO of MoneyGram 2 weeks ago, and he's upset with us because we're not moving fast enough. That was an unbelievable, you don't often have that happen. And he wants us to launch on-demand liquidity, formerly known as xRapid, in more markets more quickly because they're having such a good experience with Mexico that they're like, look, we want to be able to spread this more quickly, more aggressively. So that's great, but we're not going to launch new markets until we've engaged regulators in those markets. We know that the exchanges on the other end are robust and compliant and all the things that go with that.
Another question. Yes.
Jade.
Yes.
I met you earlier.
Yes, you did. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I know Ripple is expanding and hiring massively through just the people that's been experienced best in government relation or maybe just in engineering. But what advice could you give just to students such as myself and who are not really blockchain experienced but want to be able to get involved in this new asset class and just who are hungry and passionate just for the new valuation?
Yeah. Look, I mean, one of the things that Ripple, so we are about 400 employees now, and if I see an employee at Ripple post a job description that says, hey, we want somebody that has 10 years of experience in this industry, you're like, wait a minute, this industry didn't exist 10 years ago. So the good news you have is you're not competing with somebody who has years and years of experience in crypto because the industry is still new. I guess the best advice I have as you're thinking about getting into this industry is don't worry about what your job is on day one. You just want to be in the door. I mean, I can already look at employees who joined Ripple 2 or 3 years ago, and we've been fortunate because we're growing a lot, but they started doing X, and now they have been promoted twice and are doing something totally different because they are ambitious, they're smart, they're hardworking, and so my advice to some degree is like, don't worry about how to get in the door, just get in the door. And if you learn a skill set around this industry, betting the next 10 or 15 or 20 years of your career on blockchain, regardless of where you start, I think is a good bet. And so when I talk to young students who are thinking about which industry you want to bet on, when I came out of business school in 1997, I made a bet that the internet was an interesting space to do that. Now 4 or 5 years ago, I made a bet that, look, I think blockchain is here to stay. I think it's going to continue to grow and affect more and more industries. And so I think, if you're a student in this space at all, I think dive in with both feet or jump, whatever. Don't dive.
Well, yeah, and that's, I talk so often to some of my colleagues at the European Commission, I can't remember if I came up with it or some of them. What do you call, what will people be calling fintech 5 years from now? And the answer, finance,
Yeah.
But to get to some of the changes, we also have in the audience, I see the former general counsel for the IMF, you're mentioning and you do have not only a proliferation of sort of stable coins and new kinds of private sort of currency options, but you also have central banks getting much more actively involved in the digital asset space. And we had a conversation a little bit about that earlier, especially earlier in the week, where we had the heads of fintech from some of the central banks who are sort of toying with different variations of an idea of central bank digital currencies. I mean, what does that do to your business, and how does that shape and impact sort of the cryptocurrency space more generally?
Well, I think central bank issued digital assets are analogous to stable coins, but obviously issued by the central bank. The thing that's confusing for me, and I know there's at least one person here earlier from the Fed. If I'm a bank and I have access to and I go to the Fed window today for liquidity, I'm not getting a crate of dollars. I'm getting a ledger entry, a digital ledger entry. And so it's a little bit confusing to me. There's been a lot of attention. I think the testimony from Mark Zuckerberg today is talking in part about what's happening in China and the apparent intended launch of a central bank digital asset in China representing the RMB. What I don't know how that China works in this regard. I know enough about the US to be dangerous. But I don't really understand if the Fed window is giving me digitized dollars already, what's the difference between issuing a digitized dollar versus issuing a digital token representing a dollar? I've also made the same point about the JPM coin. I'm sure there's somebody here from JP Morgan.
Probably.
I'm just going to offend as many people as I can. So the JPM coin, the only way you get a JPM coin is if you deposit $1 into your JP Morgan account, and you can only use the JPM coin intra-JPM. How is that different than a JPM dollar? Like, I don't get why we had to tokenize the JPM coin. Anyway, there's things like that.
Which is interesting because as far as I understand from some of there are conversations when people are thinking about this for Libra, are you an ETF? Well, okay, if we remove the currencies from the basket and we just make it into a sort of a purely dollar-based basket, then you just get into the question of, are you just merely digitizing the dollar for that particular network?
Can I say one on Libra, just because you brought it up? You didn't ask this question, but I'm just going to go. Look, I think a lot of people assume that I and Ripple are anti-Libra. I'm actually not anti-Libra at all. I think it's not competitive with what Ripple's doing, and I kind of view it as, well, if Libra is going to be kind of a new payment network, well, it's going to need to be interoperable with other networks, and so that's what Ripple wants to do. So, hey, Godspeed. The reason why I think people perceive me as being anti-Libra is because, one, I think that they have gone out into the marketplace in a way that was not good for crypto. Because, it was after Libra was announced that the president of the United States tweets out, like, I don't like cryptocurrencies. I'm like, oh, shit,
I'm sure it was a good day.
Yeah. Look, I think what Libra and maybe Facebook got wrong is that any financial service, the foundation of any financial service is trust. It's trust. Facebook, by their own acknowledgement in today's testimony, they have a deficit on trust. We can debate, is that fair or unfair or how we got here, but the reality is that's where we are. And so for me, when I saw Facebook leading the effort around the Libra white paper, I thought, look, PayPal was part of the initial Libra, they've stepped out, but had PayPal announced Libra and not Facebook.
Oh, well,
PayPal announced it and then Facebook joined. Wouldn't that be a different world right now? And by the way, maybe Libra is a fabulous thing and we want it to succeed, but I think Facebook, in almost frankly an arrogant way, decided we want to be on point here. We're going to lead it, and I think they didn't understand the trust deficit they had with governments particularly. I see there's a question out there. Sorry.
Yes. Right. One last question.
Hi, Fletcher McCrum with Cognizant. I lead our partnerships in the blockchain space. And I'm curious your approach around the different networks that are forming. Obviously, Ripple is forming a network. There are competitors out there like the IIN and Swift's exploring. And there's also complementary networks, maybe things like TradeIX and WeTrade, Marco Polo, particularly in trade finance spaces. That's very international. So how do you view strategically some of the competitive networks they're trying to form versus some of the complementary networks and where Ripple fits in?
First of all, I'll tell you up front, I mean, he mentioned a handful of networks I've never heard of, so my reaction anytime people ask me about kind of competitive networks, I mean, we're trying to create interoperability between networks. We call that RippleNet. I don't view that as a closed network, meaning, it isn't, I don't view myself as a competitor to PayPal or Alipay or Paytm or fill in blank. I think about it as like, how do we become the TCP/IP of an internet of value? Our whole mission, if you look at internally at Ripple, our vision for the company is to enable value to move the way information moves today. And so when I think about these different networks, what I'm thinking to myself, and I hear some of those that I hadn't heard of, what I'm thinking to myself is, okay, wouldn't it be great if all of them were interoperable? Wouldn't it be great if a gentleman here in DC whose mom lives in Mumbai and has a Paytm digital wallet, but the gentleman here in DC is on BAML, if you want to send $50 from your BAML account to your mom on Mother's Day in India, good luck. Like if you get any money there, it won't be $50, it'll be a whole lot less. But if those are just two interoperable nodes connected through a common framework around technologies, like why isn't that super simple? The vision we see using XRP as that bridge asset is extremely fast and extremely inexpensively. You're shuttling that value from a BAML account to a Paytm account, no big deal.
Only because it's 45 seconds, but I see the European Commission has their hand up. Speak really fast.
Okay, the question is maybe a very naive question, but could you speak a little bit as to how do you actually make money yourself in this?
Yep.
How does Ripple make profit or not a profit?
I said up front, at the most basic level, we're an enterprise software company. We sell software to banks. So typically when we sign a contract with one of these players, there's software licensing fees, there's transaction fees, there's professional services fees. We also own a lot of XRP. That is an asset we own in the same way, look, Exxon owns a lot of oil. Exxon's selling some of that oil and making money from doing that. So we think about both of those components.
How much XRP?
We own about 55 or 50, I don't know the exact math, 56% plus or minus of all XRP is owned by Ripple.
Okay, we have to end it. Oh,
right.
yeah.
Oh, they turned off the mic.
They did turn off the mic. Okay. We are efficient. We are an efficient system.
So do you ever see Ripple standing out as a standalone currency other than just a mechanism to transfer fiat currency, $50 to Mumbai? Can it stand alone?
Can it stand alone? I don't understand. Can XRP stand alone?
Talk about transferring value to Mumbai. It's always tied to a fiat currency.
Yes.
So it's a transfer
right.
mechanism.
Yeah,
Are we
do I
always
see
going to be tied to fiat currency?
Transforming from bridge to currency.
Well, look, for the foreseeable future, my viewpoint is fiat currencies and G20 markets serve the consumer use case very effectively. Why am I going to go try to disrupt the rupee?
So you just want to be a transfer mechanism?
What Ripple is focused on right now is to be infrastructure for banks or financial institutions to shuttle value. We're not trying to replace any fiat currency. Now, as I said earlier, there may be somebody in this room who's using the open source technology of the XRP ledger and is trying to build a consumer remittance application through XRP. There's nothing that I can do about that.
You're not a threat to government structure.
I am definitely not. Yeah, when I go in and explain to central governments how we work, they're like, okay, good.
Okay.
We're gonna get. I'm gonna get the hook.
This is literally the closest we've gotten to the hook. But
We're out.
let me just say, Brad, thank you so much for coming.
Absolutely,
man.
thank you.
I appreciate it. It's the extra time.